There's a theory circulating in royal commentary right now that's genuinely striking once you actually sit with it. The idea that Harry's entire post-royal strategy was never really about escaping the monarchy at all. It was about eventually inheriting it.
This is a disaster for the king. The king looks foolish, the king looks weak, and the British public will not tolerate it. It could have a very serious impact on the monarchy itself. Let's hope the king lives a long time, but the longer he lives while indulging all of this from Harry and Meghan, the more they damage, undermine, and weaken the institution.
Let's start with what's actually being reported about Charles's own role in this return specifically, because that's where the more solid ground actually sits, before we get anywhere near the more dramatic theory itself. Tom Sykes, writing for The Royalist and a veteran royal correspondent with a properly long track record covering this family, has argued that any suggestion Charles wasn't fully aware of and effectively enabling Harry and Meghan's return is, in his words, frankly absurd.
He thinks America's the new Nirvana or something. Let him stay there and say, sorry, here's your British passport, and rip it up in front of him and say, no thanks. If you want to come back here, you come as a foreign visitor with an American passport, and good luck trying to get in.
Well, I actually agree, because the thing is, what they did was so treacherous. Do you hear quite often people say, oh, what did they really do? They lied about the British royal family.
Sykes's broader argument is that the two people who've spent years publicly describing the monarchy as cruel, deceptive, and uncaring are now reportedly positioned more favorably than any previous non-working royal has ever been, and that the public is currently being prepared for a significant costly security arrangement to match, without ever having been given a clear, honest explanation for why that positioning changed so dramatically. Consider what Sykes is actually claiming here, because it's a fairly serious allegation about institutional dishonesty overall. He's not simply suggesting Charles was caught off guard by some emotional, spur-of-the-moment family decision. He's suggesting a father knowingly, deliberately, and quite consciously allowed his son to remain formally connected to royal life, titles intact, official status maintained, throughout years of sustained public criticism, all while the broader public narrative suggested genuine institutional distance had been established.
Breaking today, King Charles has been accused of lying about Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's return to the UK, as monarchists increasingly feel betrayed by our head of state.
If accurate, that would mean the entire framing of Harry and Meghan as fully independent, separated from royal structures, has never actually reflected the underlying reality on the ground. Sykes goes further, pointing to what he sees as a properly revealing pattern. Despite 6 years of public criticism directed at the institution, Harry reportedly still holds his formal titles, remains listed as a Counselor of State, and hasn't faced any visible censure from his father throughout the entire period. Sykes's specific argument is that this consistent lack of any public pushback from Charles, sustained across years, effectively demonstrates a father quietly folding his son back into official life well before any of this became public.
Really? Well, those of us who actually covered the Diana story knew that Diana was an incredibly savvy woman. She would never have tolerated Meghan Markle. She would have kicked her straight out of Kensington Palace as soon as she saw her, because she would have seen her as a scheming, manipulative cow. And there was only one scheming, manipulative cow allowed in the Kensington Palace, and that was Diana.
Look closely at that specific word, Counselor of State, because it carries genuine constitutional weight that's easy to overlook amid the broader emotional narrative. That's not a symbolic or ceremonial title. It's a formal, legally defined role that grants Harry actual authority to act on the monarch's behalf under specific circumstances should the need arise. Maintaining that particular status across 6 years of public estrangement is a properly notable institutional choice, one that would have required deliberate decisions to preserve rather than simply neglecting to formally revoke it through inaction. He also directly challenges the palace's own timeline. The suggestion that Charles only learned about the move the Sunday before it broke. Sykes describes that specific claim as simply not making sense and connects it to the earlier separate departure of Clive Alderton, the king's long-serving chief courtier, who left his role several weeks before this story became public.
And I think that approach from William is strong, like take the titles away, take everything away. I mean, personally, I guess you probably can't do this, Mike, but personally, I'd say, make it so unpleasant for them to ever want to set foot in this country again.
Sykes's implication is that Alderton's departure and the timing of this announcement aren't unrelated coincidences. Think carefully about why that specific connection actually matters here, well beyond the simple timing overlap on its own. A chief courtier's departure, especially someone who's reportedly served faithfully in that particular role for a considerable stretch of years, typically involves months of careful institutional planning and gradual transition rather than sudden, unexpected resignation. If Alderton's exit actually, in reality, relates directly to internal disagreement over how this whole situation was being carefully managed, that suggests real, palpable friction inside the palace itself well before any public announcement. Friction significant enough to reportedly cost a senior aide his own position entirely.
As Nadine Dorries said, regularly turns up at these social occasions. And I just don't think people are going to be that warm to Harry and Meghan and the Cotswolds.
Well, the thing is, the bottom line is nobody likes them. It's that simple. And one of the reasons why they may be leaving California and Montecito is that they've fallen out with everybody there as well. You know, Oprah Winfrey doesn't speak to them anymore, as far as I'm aware. The other people who are sort of living in that rather, you know, rich enclave of California near Santa Barbara, which is a lovely part of the world, you know, they've got not a patch on any of those people in terms of money.
Sykes has real long-standing sourcing within royal circles, and connecting a staff departure to a specific later announcement remains an inference rather than confirmed fact. A reasonable theory, not a proven sequence of events. But it's an inference worth taking seriously, given everything else lining up around it. There's also a considerably more cynical read worth including here, one that treats the entire Alderton timing as beside the point. Some royal watchers argue Charles simply never needed a dramatic staff departure to know exactly what his son was planning. That a father and son who'd reportedly had tea together in July would naturally have discussed something this significant well before any formal briefing to newspapers, staff departures aside entirely. Sykes's broader warning is that this specific situation represents a genuine reputational risk for Charles personally, that continuing to indulge Harry and Meghan's return, in his view, actively damages and undermines the institution the longer it continues.
But 98% of the public say, no, we're not paying £5 million a year. Can you believe the king is just going to ignore all of us? This does feel like a huge betrayal.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? But it also feels like an awful lot of, toing and froing going on, because we're now reading that if they do come, and we were told originally they were coming at the end of this week, I think, they might only come for 6 months now. They might not come.
He specifically flags what he considers the most combustible flashpoint still to come. If the Sussexes arrive at Heathrow with any kind of police escort, after having been told directly by the courts they weren't entitled to state-funded protection, Sykes describes that specific scenario as something the public simply won't tolerate, framing it as exactly the kind of quiet workaround that would confirm suspicions the king found an informal route to something the legal system had already denied. Picture how that specific scenario would actually play out publicly if it happens. A high court had previously formally denied this exact family automatic state security. If a police escort then materializes anyway, through some informal arrangement rather than a transparent, publicly announced policy change that creates an actually uncomfortable precedent, suggesting that formal legal rulings can simply be quietly circumvented when the person involved happens to have the right family connections. That's precisely the kind of story that tends to generate lasting institutional damage, regardless of how the underlying security decision actually gets justified internally.
Oh, do bug off. Do bog off. Seriously. Prince Harry is a failed humanitarian. What else explains him this week literally cutting and running away from the African Parks organization that once he believed was going to change that continent?
That specific security question is honestly where public sentiment appears most sharply united. According to recent polling, only around 2% of the British public support taxpayer-funded security for Harry and Meghan, a strikingly small number, especially notable because it apparently includes people who otherwise remain broadly sympathetic to the couple. That's honestly worth sitting with as a specific statistic, because 2% represents about as close to unanimous public opposition as any measurable policy question typically gets in British polling. Most contested political and social issues, even properly divisive ones, tend to show considerably more range in public opinion. A result this lopsided suggests something closer to broad consensus across the political spectrum, rather than the more typical pattern of entrenched, roughly evenly split camps talking past each other.
The massive destabilization caused by this return alone is insane, and yet there has been no censure from the king at all for the destruction Harry and Meghan have wrought. Incredibly, Harry is still a Councillor of State. He is still on the royal website. He has his titles. The kids have their titles. Harry is being folded back into British life by his father.
Andrew Neil, a properly experienced mainstream broadcaster with decades of credibility across British media, went viral recently for a pointed response to a much earlier clip of Harry, one where Harry had reportedly delivered a fairly vague apologetic statement about the world not being a better place, seemingly scripted rather than personally written. Neil's response was blunt, questioning why anyone should particularly care what Harry thinks on matters he has no real qualification or expertise to speak on, and suggesting, somewhat sarcastically, that a public whip-around to simply keep the couple comfortably settled in Montecito might be the more efficient solution for everyone involved. That specific response resonated widely precisely because of who delivered it.
And I count myself as a monarchist and a royalist, and if you annoy us, then who do you have left? And this is where actually, Mike, I have great sympathy for Prince William. And just hear me out on this, right? Because I think he gets it, Mike. I think he understands that Harry and Meghan back in the United Kingdom is completely untenable.
Neil isn't a tabloid commentator with an obvious appetite for royal controversy. He's a properly established mainstream broadcast journalist whose credibility rests substantially on measured, considered analysis across decades of serious political coverage. When someone with that particular reputation reaches for pointed sarcasm rather than careful, neutral commentary, it signals something worth noting about how far public patience has apparently worn thin, even among commentators who don't typically engage with celebrity-adjacent royal stories at all. That specific joke landed because it captured something a meaningful portion of the public apparently already felt: less outright hostility, and more a kind of exhausted skepticism toward the broader public performance surrounding this couple's choices. Now, here's the theory itself, and it's a real one some commentators hold, not something anyone's actually proven. The theory goes roughly like this: that Harry's underlying goal, across years of public criticism directed at William and Catherine specifically, was never really separation from the monarchy at all. It was making royal life difficult enough, publicly enough, that William and Catherine might eventually choose to step back from the line of succession entirely, which would move Harry considerably closer to the throne himself.
I think that's exactly what they were trying to do. And they were trying to kind of chase everybody away. And suddenly they'd go, oh, look, isn't it great? We've got this modern royal family. Look, I'm married to this, woman. And isn't it fantastic? And isn't it marvelous? And isn't it really showing that diversity is our strength and all of that?
Think through the actual mechanics of what that theory would require to be true, because it's honestly worth stress testing rather than accepting or rejecting purely on emotional grounds. It would mean years of public interviews, a memoir, a Netflix documentary, and sustained media criticism directed at William and Catherine specifically, all functioning as a coordinated long-term strategy toward a single eventual outcome: Catherine and William choosing, voluntarily, to remove their own children from the line of succession entirely. That's an honestly extreme, almost implausible endpoint on its face, given how deeply embedded succession expectations are within royal life from birth, and how unlikely it seems that sustained public pressure alone would ever produce that specific result, rather than simply generating sympathy for the family under attack.
Right, I am Team Meghan. But the reason I'm Team Meghan is because of all of the vitriol that she has been on the receiving end of. A lot of it, of which was racist. Let's call it what it was. When you compare those headlines side by side of how Catherine and Meghan are portrayed in newspapers for engaging in exactly the same behavior, whether it's ordering flowers for their wedding or favoring a particular type of scented candle or stroking their baby bump.
There's a specific detail some proponents of this theory point to that's honestly worth including, whatever you ultimately make of the broader claim. Catherine specifically, rather than William, has often been the sharper target of criticism attributed to Sussex-aligned sources over the years. Comparisons around parenting style, wardrobe spending, even how she's photographed at public events. If the underlying goal really were destabilizing the institution enough to trigger a succession rethink, targeting the future queen consort specifically rather than the future king would be a fairly calculated choice. She's the one whose public standing most directly shapes whether the wider public still wants William's branch of the family running the show decades from now. It's a theory some commentators have publicly floated, connected to a broader argument that a considerable amount of the public criticism directed at William and Catherine over recent years originated from coordinated media strategy rather than organic coverage. The logic runs that Harry's team understood exactly what kind of pressure sustained personal criticism of a future king and queen would generate. Pressure that, in this reading, was never really about accountability at all, but about making the job itself look increasingly unappealing. There's a more measured version of this same underlying observation worth including, separate from the more extreme succession framing. Regardless of whether Harry's ultimate goal was ever actually the throne itself, it's honestly documented and uncontroversial that his public statements, interviews, and written memoir have repeatedly, specifically criticized William and Catherine's own conduct and choices, alongside broader institutional criticism. That specific pattern of targeted, personal criticism toward his own brother and sister-in-law, rather than purely general institutional critique, is worth noting on its own terms, entirely separate from any theory about deeper strategic motive underneath it. Whatever the motive, the effect has reportedly been real. Genuine documented friction that's outlasted every attempted reconciliation photo op and every carefully worded palace statement claiming otherwise. Whether or not that specific succession theory holds any truth, there's a separate, more grounded argument worth taking seriously, that William himself may be pursuing a deliberate, considered strategy in response to all of this, modeled loosely on how the family handled the Duke of Windsor after his abdication decades ago. That historical precedent involved a fairly complete, permanent exclusion, no ongoing role, no meaningful path back into official life, essentially a closed door. That historical comparison is worth actually unpacking a bit further because it's a properly instructive precedent rather than a purely rhetorical flourish. The Duke of Windsor's exile following his abdication remains one of the most consequential institutional decisions in modern royal history, a decision that effectively removed him from any meaningful public role for the remainder of his life, regardless of ongoing family tension or occasional informal contact. If William is actually drawing on that specific historical model as his own preferred approach, it suggests a considerably harder, more permanent stance than the current public reconciliation narrative implies, one built around sustained distance rather than any eventual warmer resolution. Some commentators have suggested William favors something similar here. Titles properly removed, no meaningful path back to official royal life, effectively making any return to Britain considerably less appealing through sustained, consistent distance rather than any dramatic public confrontation. That's a coherent, plausible strategic read, distinct from the more speculative succession theory, and worth taking seriously as one genuine possibility for how William might actually be approaching this. There's a meaningful practical distinction worth naming between these two approaches, because they'd actually produce properly different public outcomes going forward. A dramatic public confrontation generates immediate headlines but tends to fade relatively quickly from sustained attention. Sustained, quiet distance, by contrast, works considerably more slowly but potentially more durably, gradually reducing public interest and relevance over time rather than generating one explosive moment followed by inevitable questions about what happens next. If William actually believes patient, sustained distance ultimately serves the institution better than confrontation, that would explain his reported reluctance to engage publicly with Harry at all, even in situations where a more combative response might seem tempting. Compare that to how the Windsor situation actually played out over decades. Occasional, tightly controlled family contact, no public warmth, no path back to relevance. If that's actually the template, expect very little in the way of joint appearances going forward, regardless of whatever softer language gets used publicly by palace communications teams trying to keep the peace. If this kind of layered breakdown interests you, the like button genuinely helps this channel keep digging into stories like this one. There's a specific, well-sourced anecdote worth including here, because it captures something real about how this return is actually being received locally, away from the more abstract national debate that dominates most coverage. Nadine Dorries, a former senior cabinet minister who now lives locally in the Cotswolds and has a social circle reportedly including Queen Camilla herself, wrote recently and in some detail about the immediate local reaction once news of the couple's potential move to the area broke. According to her account, her phone reportedly received more than 30 WhatsApp messages within minutes, many from local community group chats, with residents expressing concern about everything from security details disrupting the school run to a fairly pointed comment questioning whether the couple had ever heard of Daylesford, a well-known local organic food brand, implying the area already had its own established version of the wholesome, artisanal lifestyle Meghan's brand promotes. Doris herself added a direct message of her own to that specific post, addressed hypothetically to Harry and Meghan directly, that the Cotswolds isn't especially dazzled by celebrity, royal or otherwise, that they'd be treated with basic privacy and respect if they actually integrated into the community properly, but that any sense of entitlement wouldn't be well received locally, given that a considerable number of her actual neighbors would regard the couple's finances as fairly modest by comparison to established local wealth. That's a genuinely interesting detail worth sitting with, because it complicates the simpler narrative of universal warmth or universal hostility. The Cotswolds specifically is home to a considerable concentration of actually wealthy, low-profile residents who reportedly aren't especially impressed by celebrity status on its own, meaning Harry and Meghan's specific brand of fame may land rather differently there than it has elsewhere. There's also a broader argument circulating about the couple's standing in America specifically, worth including here for balance rather than treating the UK reaction as the only relevant angle. Several commentators have suggested that part of the underlying motivation for this move traces back to a genuine falling out with much of their previous social circle in Montecito, with figures like Oprah Winfrey reportedly no longer in regular contact, and several other prominent local residents apparently keeping a comfortable distance. Whether that specific characterization is fully accurate is difficult to verify independently, but it's consistent with broader reporting we've covered previously about the couple's shifting social standing in California. Consider what this specific detail actually adds to the broader picture we've been building tonight. If genuine social isolation in America is a real contributing factor here, it complicates any simple narrative treating this move purely as strategic maneuvering toward eventual royal reintegration. People experiencing real social difficulty in one location sometimes do relocate for entirely straightforward reasons unrelated to any grander institutional strategy. Simple desire for a fresh start, proximity to family, or genuine homesickness after years away. That doesn't rule out the more strategic reads we've discussed. But it's worth holding space for the possibility that ordinary human motivations are doing at least some of the actual work here, alongside whatever institutional calculations may also be happening simultaneously. On the financial side specifically, there's been renewed attention to Elton John's own reported comments about being asked to help cover Harry's mounting legal costs, a story that's picked up fresh momentum precisely because it lands right alongside all this succession chatter. According to multiple reports, Elton reportedly pushed back fairly directly, essentially rejecting the framing of himself as some kind of ongoing financial backstop for the couple's legal troubles. That specific detail has circulated widely enough that it's worth noting here, though we've covered the broader context of Harry's legal costs in more depth previously. That specific dynamic connects to something worth naming plainly. Long-term friendships involving properly significant wealth disparities often carry real, unspoken tension around exactly this kind of expectation. The assumption, whether explicit or implicit, that a wealthier friend might reasonably help cover unexpected costs during a genuine crisis. The sort of quiet obligation nobody actually writes down anywhere. Whether Elton's reported pushback reflects a specific limit on this particular request or a broader frustration with a longer pattern of similar expectations isn't entirely clear from available reporting, but it does suggest that even Harry's closest, longest-standing relationships aren't immune to real strain once serious financial questions enter the picture. So, pulling this all together, what's the actual, fair picture that emerges once you separate the solid reporting from the more speculative theories? Let me actually walk through each piece one more time in order, because there's genuine value in laying out exactly how much confidence each specific claim deserves before drawing any broader conclusion. Tom Sussexes' reporting on Charles's likely awareness carries real weight given his sourcing and track record. The security funding debate reflects overwhelming, measurable public sentiment against taxpayer-funded protection. The succession theory remains one commentators have floated, not something anyone can actually prove. and the reaction from actual Cotswolds residents suggests a considerably more complicated local reception than either uncritical warmth or blanket hostility. None of these threads individually settles the larger question of how this entire situation actually resolves in the end. But together, they suggest an institution navigating real internal tension, a public that's remained remarkably consistent in its skepticism regardless of the specific angle being covered, and a family working through actually difficult questions about access, security, and succession that don't have clean, satisfying answers regardless of which theory eventually proves most accurate. Whatever the actual underlying truth turns out to be, once the more dramatic theories eventually get tested against reality itself, the specific details we've walked through tonight, the security polling, the local Cotswolds reaction, Sussexes sourcing on Alderton, the historical Duke of Windsor comparison, represent the actual, verifiable ground this entire story is standing on, well before anyone gets to the more speculative question of what Harry may or may not have secretly wanted from any of it. What do you think? Does Tom Sussexes reporting about Charles quietly enabling this return over years, rather than reacting suddenly to recent news, change how you read the King's own public statements about being surprised by the announcement? Or does that specific reading require assuming a level of coordinated institutional deception that seems difficult to sustain quietly across 6 full years without ever leaking earlier? And on the succession theory specifically, is that a properly plausible read on Harry's underlying motivations across years of public criticism directed at his brother? Or does that kind of psychological speculation about someone's secret intentions go considerably further than the actual evidence can responsibly support? These are honestly different questions worth answering separately, because you can find the Charles enabling theory entirely credible while still rejecting the more extreme succession framing as speculation too far, or vice versa. Let me know your honest take in the comments below. I'm curious where people actually land on this after hearing everything laid out this way, piece by piece. And if breakdowns like this one, the kind that actually try to separate solid reporting from speculation rather than blending everything together, are what you come here for, go ahead and subscribe to Palace Insider so you don't miss the next one.